It's well known that throughout the Second World War, the Germans were building a plethora of weird weapons they hoped might turn the tide. Not to be outdone by a man with a smaller mustache, Stalin went all in on crazy weapon designs too. Reflecting his focus on land and air warfare, the big man in Moscow greenlit a whole host of experimental weapons projects. In this video, we shed light on just 8 of Stalin's mad projects, saving the craziest for last. By the end of the First World War, all the European armies had realized that tanks would be critical in the inevitable round 2. But how do you make your tanks better than everyone else's? The Russians threw their best German scientists at the problem and came up with the monstrous T-35. What made this tank superior? It had 5 turrets. It was also enormous, weighing 54 tons when loaded for battle. Obscenely expensive, the Soviets were forced to stop production in 1939 after they'd made 61 of these monsters. Gigantic, slow, and prone to breaking down, the T-35 had a terrible combat record. Some were thrown into chaotic defensive battles during the initial phases of Operation Barbarossa. This wasn't to halt the German advance, but to get rid of a vehicle most officers consider a total liability. The 1930s were the golden age of crazy Soviet weapons, and a major reason for this was resources. The rapidly industrializing Soviet Union was keen to manufacture everything using its nationally available materials. This worked great until Konstantin Kalinin of the Kharkiv Aviation Bureau asked for metal to build his massive experimental plane. The government gave him steel. Steel is pretty strong but also very heavy, so when Kalinin built his plane, the K-7, he had to add extra engines to get it off the ground. That meant increasing the wingspan to maximize lift too, and the project grew out of hand. The final prototype was 53 meters from wingtip to wingtip and weighed a whopping 38 tons. The behemoth needed 8 engines to get off the ground, but could deliver 112 paratroopers or drop 19 tons of bombs. During the K-7's initial set of test flights, the crew discovered the engines vibrated so much that they damaged the airframe. The engineers tried to fix this by shortening the tail booms, but this made the monster plane so unstable that it crashed on its next test flight, killing everyone on board. The project was scrapped. For most people, tanks and planes are 2 very different types of vehicles that don't share many design features, but the Soviets thought a little differently. Oleg Antonov, the famous aircraft designer, looked at a tank and decided he would make it fly. The idea was simple. Wings and a tail would be attached to a T-60 light tank, allowing it to glide. Then, this tank glider would be towed to its target by a TB-3 heavy bomber. When the tank crew were overhead their destination, they would glide the tank gently down to Earth where they could support paratroopers right away. Antonov called it the A-40. While it seems crazy to us, for the Russians, airdropping tanks wasn't out of the question. The TB-3 bomber had successfully airdropped T-27 tankettes from a few meters above the ground during the 1940 Bessarabia campaign. If they were left in neutral, the T-27s could roll to a stop when they hit the ground. The problem was that the crews were dropped separately and often lost their tanks. Amazingly, the A-40 actually worked during its only test flight. After detaching from the bomber, the pilot landed safely, detached the wings, and drove the tank back to base. The bomber pilot, however, was not happy. He almost crashed trying to drag the immensely heavy vehicle into the air. Soviet heavy bombers were in short supply and more valuable than experimental flying tanks, so the project was shelved. The Soviet Union of the 1930s had some weapons projects that weren't necessarily crazy, just way ahead of their time. One of them was a naval hovercraft built by Vladimir Levkov. Using air cushion technology, Levkov wanted to build an exceptionally speedy attack craft for the Red Navy. In 1932, he built a 2.5 meter model and tested it successfully. This caught the eye of Stalin's Navy mates, and they had Levkov transferred to the Moscow Aviation Institute. With access to the Institute's resources, Levkov quickly scaled up his plans and completed the first prototype hovercraft in 1935. It was named the L1 and could reach speeds of 60 knots on a calm sea. 2 years later, he built the upgraded L5. This prototype really impressed the admirals. It had a cabin for the pilot and a mechanic, a machine gun turret, a troop compartment, torpedoes, and depth charges. It was fast too, with a top speed of 70 knots. The L5's only drawback was its engines. They often stalled if water got into the intake, which happened in even marginally rough seas. Levkov spent a few years working on a better design, but it was too late. The German invasion forced him to relocate to Siberia, and Stalin demanded he worked on a new project, troop transport gliders. Despite its early success, the project was over and the hovercrafts were scrapped. This next vehicle is a classic example of a Russian solution to a Russian problem. I imagine the development went like this. Comrade Igor, how to move soldier quickly in deep snow in middle of glorious Soviet winter. Ah, Comrade Ivan, it is simple. We make sled from old car and old plane. But what if we must kill fascists too? We attach machine gun. The resulting vehicle was named the Aerosand and was extremely successful. There were many iterations, but the basic design was a two-man cockpit with a gunner up front and the pilot behind, sitting on 4 skis and powered by an aircraft or car engine spinning a propeller. The Aerosand was set low to the ground, giving it exceptional maneuverability on ice and snow. In snowy conditions that stopped trucks and tanks, the Aerosand could zip around easily, carrying out reconnaissance, transmitting messages, and raiding enemy supply lines. One of the most successful Aerosandi was the RF-8, which was used against the Finns during the Winter War and the Germans during the freezing winters on the Eastern Front. Before the adoption of the aforementioned T-38 heavy tank, the Soviets experimented with plans for an even bigger monster, the T-42 super heavy tank. Like the T-35, this behemoth had 5 separate turrets, one armed with a 107mm howitzer, 2 with 45mm anti-tank guns, and 2 with 7.62mm machine guns. It needed a crew of 14 to 15 to operate and would have weighed over 100 tons. The design team quickly ran into a problem. Even with their German engineering expertise, they couldn't develop an engine capable of producing 2,000 horsepower. It was 1932 and an engine capable of powering their monster tank was still 6 years away from being invented. To remedy this, the design team decided just to use 2 1,000 horsepower engines. This made the already massive tank even bigger. The final T-42 was such a huge target for bombing planes that it needed to keep 2 machine gun turrets reserved as anti-aircraft guns, something no other tank needed. The design eventually got so massive that the Soviets canned the project. The T-42 never left the drawing board. What's the best way to increase the range of your aircraft? The Germans thought better engines, the Brits thought better fuel, and the Americans thought more planes. But the Soviets had a different idea, bolting several planes together. Called the Tsveno project, Soviet designers wanted their heavy bombers to be able to carry several fighter planes and deploy them from the air. The idea was that fighters could be deployed at further ranges, escort the bombers, and carry heavier payloads. Early designs had fighter planes fixed to the top of the bombers, but tests proved that getting them up there was very difficult, so they bolted them under the wings instead. Shockingly, the crazy idea worked pretty well. Testing showed that the Tsveno SPB was the most practical. A TB3 heavy bomber would take off with 2 stumpy Polikarpov I-16s under the wings. The I-16s would detach and then dive bomb their target, returning to base under their own power. In July 1940, Tsveno SPBs of the Black Sea Fleet Air Force bombed an oil depot in occupied Romania. The raid was successful, and between July and August, 30 Tsveno SPB raids were carried out on Romanian infrastructure. But as more Bf-109s appeared in the Soviet skies, the TB3 motherships became just too vulnerable. The Tsveno project was shelved by January 1942. If you thought a flying tank was absurd, you'll love this. Possibly the craziest two vehicles the Soviets, or anyone, ever tried to combine was Ushakov's flying submarine. The inventor, Boris Ushakov, started designing a seaplane and then adding modifications to allow it to submerge. The final design had 3 engines as well as a propeller at the rear. Steel plates kept the engine sealed, while compartments inside the craft were flooded. One of these compartments was the cockpit, so the crew would have to climb into another compartment to pilot the subplane while underwater. The rationale was that the crazy contraption would search for enemy shipping from air, then once it had located a target, fly ahead, land, and submerge until the ship steamed into torpedo range. To facilitate this, the subplane would have to fly around with a periscope, batteries, and torpedoes. The Soviet admirals humoured Ushakov for a time, but they never gave him enough resources to make his invention work. Cool as it may have been to fly around in a submarine, the design just never got off the ground. Those were 8 of the craziest World War II era experimental vehicles the Soviet Union ever designed. Why do you think the Soviets didn't try to build a tank that was also a submarine? What about a tank with smaller tanks inside of it? Are you as surprised as us that some of these vehicles actually worked? Let us know in the comments section below. And just before you run off, guys, if you're enjoying our channel here, you'll enjoy our new channel called The Brave, where we post weekly videos about badasses from all different eras of history, not just World War II. That's the first link in the description below. And if you just want to listen to some cool beats that we use in some of the videos on this channel, then check out our Relax Jack music channel, also in the description below. And if you want to get access to behind the scenes Discord and exclusive videos, consider donating to the Patreon. And if you just want to join our wider community, make sure you check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Discord. All of these links and more are in the description below. Anyways, guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.